Good afternoon. I am Arthur Melman. I'm the chairman of the Easthampton Airport Management Advisory Committee and a member of the GGG. During these shows, we are examining the airport, its operations, its finances, and its future. With me today, we have two other members of the Airport Management Advisory Committee. On my immediate right is Gene Oshrin. Gene restores and flies vintage airplanes and is a member of the Executive Committee of the Easthampton Airport Pilots Association. To his right is David Gruber. David is a lawyer, investment banker, and now writing a thesis for his PhD and has been long involved with trying to control noise at the airport. In our first segment, we discussed the finances of the airport, and we showed that the airport was self-financing, doesn't need tax revenues. But as this chart will show, we also found that the airport was spending precious little on maintaining its facilities, with the result that there was dramatic amounts of deferred maintenance and poor facilities at the airport. In that show, the second segment, we also saw that there were a proliferation of lawsuits. The lawsuits will be discussed in a subsequent segment, but for now, we'll just focus on one, and that is the third lawsuit, which was brought against the town to require it to improve the facilities that had been deteriorating. The runways, the deer fence, the tree penetrations, and so forth. Today, we're going to start with the tree penetrations. And Gene, could you tell us a little bit about what happens when you come into this runway? Let's say you're going to land at runway 10.
Well, the instrument approach that's used now for runway 10 requires trees to be trimmed to a acceptable height according to FAA standards. Within AMAC, we have discussed FAA required 34:1 approach profile, 20:1 approach profile, and all have significant differences in the amount of trees that need to be cut.
David, I'm going to let you be the person to explain a 34:1 profile and a 20:1, because they're really very significant effects of those. So I tried to explain it at our meeting and got it completely confused.
All right, this is a shorthand for the gradient of the slope of approach. A 20:1 slope means that for each foot up, you go out 20 feet. A 34:1 slope means that for each foot up, you go out 34 feet. So a 34:1 slope is much lower than a 20:1 slope.
Okay. Now, at Easthampton Airport, we've historically used 20:1 approaches, I think.
The approaches that have been in use have been according to FAA standards for 20:1 approach profile.
Yeah.
Which means higher.
Yeah.
Higher
slope.
We haven't got the best of all possible charts here for this purpose, but in general, David, this is where the airport map ends and says Town of Southampton. Now, my recollection, could you tell us what's back in here?
That's pretty much a wooded area. There are some houses nearby, but immediately to the west, it's pretty much all wooded. And I believe, although it says Town of Southampton, that doesn't mean that it's owned by the Town of Southampton. That's private property in the Town of Southampton.
Now, again, just to give us an important figure that we're going to use later, there are woods all over the airport area. Do we have any idea, what is the average height of the trees in these forests?
Well, that's something we've actually been trying very hard to determine, so far unsuccessfully. I took one trip out there with some people from Natural Resources almost 2 years ago. We took some informal measurements. It seems to me that the trees generally are between 45 and 55 feet high. There are undoubtedly some very sporty trees, very aggressive trees that are a bit higher, but that seems to be about the height of the mature forest. However, for planning purposes, to make sure that we're complying with FAA safety rules, we really have to have better numbers than that. This kind of informal estimate will not do. We need to get a much better handle on what the height of the trees really is.
Okay, so right now we're working with the engineers, the surveyors, to try to figure out really where the most penetrating trees are.
The difficulty, Arthur, is that because it's wooded, it's not, it would seem pretty, I mean, the trees aren't moving around. You'd think it's pretty easy, but the fact is that they have to be able to take a site. A surveyor needs to be able to site the top of the tree in order to figure out its height. And when you have a dense forest, you generally can't get far enough away from the tree and still see it to take a sighting. So we've been trying to find some other methods in order to do this.
Now, Gene, the FAA had a flyover in 2013, and they had some pretty sophisticated equipment. Could you just explain to everybody what happened and what the results of that
were? The FAA requires trees within the clear zone, which is the approach end of any runway, both the west end and the east end, for clearance of aircraft on instrument approaches. The clear zones were at one time, they did meet FAA requirements. Unfortunately, they weren't maintained as trimmed back.
Okay, well, this picture might actually help us understand that. It's not the best picture in the world, but at the end of this runway here, we see what is obviously a cleared zone, and then we see back in here a forest, but here we see lots of white spots, and I guess that's where, is that where some of these trees are growing up?
Yeah, the trees are encroached in from the east and from the south and from the north, reducing the size of the clear zone, which by FAA requirements have to be maintained, as originally cut.
So it seems to be pretty much non-controversial to come back in here and reduce these trees to where they always were.
You're not cutting trees that weren't cut before.
Okay. Now, the town asked the engineers and the attorneys to give us a plan of what has to be cut in order to meet the FAA requirements. The FAA in their flyover, did they tell us how to do this? What did they do?
No, they just, as best they could, tried to show the height of the trees into the clear zone, because it's not just encroaching from the east, the south, and from the north. The heights are into the approach slope, some as little as a foot, some perhaps higher than that.
Okay, so this goes back to David's point of trying to find the offending tree. If there's a tree here, a tree here, a tree here, you don't necessarily want to cut the whole forest down to catch those trees.
Maybe, Arthur, we could stop for a second and just explain a little bit more about these approaches and these slopes. In the FAA parlance, these are described as invisible surfaces because they're imaginary surfaces in the sky, either at a high angle or a lower angle. And the rule is that objects are not supposed to penetrate, to come up through that imaginary surface. So the pilot understands that if he stays above that surface, that glide slope, he's not going to hit anything. That's the purpose of this. And that's why the FAA has been reviewing airports around the country to determine whether there are penetrations of objects, such as trees, into these imaginary surfaces.
So the FAA flew over the Easthampton Airport in 2013 and showed a bunch, we'll say 20 trees or 30 trees that penetrated.
Well, they not only penetrated, they penetrated far enough so that the FAA restricted certain instrument approaches as being obstructions.
Now, how the town has obviously gotten some of those instrument approaches back. How is that?
Well, so the criteria apparently has, the FAA's criteria has apparently changed as far as the instrument approaches, the procedures, are done. I'm not an instrument pilot, so I can't give you specifics on that. But as long as there's any penetration into that, vertical plane, the FAA will require, it to be remediated, or they'll modify the instrument approaches.
So we've gotten back a bunch of those instrument approaches.
We've gotten back some.
Some with lighting and other with other instrumentation
Right.
that the FAA is.
And technology has also changed in that GPS is more accurate now, so that procedures can, the margins on the procedures can be narrowed down a little bit.
Yeah, I think one of the problems we all have here is there are pronouncements from the FAA, and then there are practical limits on how any airport, be it LaGuardia or Easthampton, can try to function within the environment in which it lives to get close to the FAA requirements and guidelines. You mentioned before, Gene, that, or David, I guess, was talking about the 20-to-1 glide path, which is what we have now, which is a fairly steep glide path, and we've all lived with.
It's a common requirement for public use airports, of the size and configuration of Easthampton.
Oh, so
it's not meant for major airport use.
So this isn't just Easthampton is under the lowest common denominator. It's many airports of our size have this. Okay, I didn't realize that.
It's about, my understanding is that 20-to-1 is about a 3% grade, and that the 34-to-1 is about a 2% grade, and major airports would likely have a 50-to-1 slope, which is closer to a 1% grade.
But you would need a different configuration airport for that. You would need more open land around it and longer runways.
Okay. Now, in our meeting about 2 months ago, the engineers and the lawyers came up with 2 plans to cut trees at Easthampton Airport. One was to comply with the 20-to-1 requirements we've now been living with, and the other was a more aggressive 34-to-1 requirement. David, you might remember, my recollection is that at 30-to-1 or 34-to-1, the town was supposed to cut trees completely over in this whole area, which would have, and also off the airport as well. And my recollection, it was about 200 acres of trees that were supposed to be cut clearly or trimmed, which obviously nobody in the town wants to see happen. Can you just explain to us some of those concerns?
Well, there are 2 different issues here.
Yeah, this is a complicated issue.
It's very
It sounds really easy to go out and cut the trees.
If it were so easy, everyone would do it.
Yeah.
Or it would be done.
Or it would be done already, that's right. There are 2 different issues here. The FAA has standards for configurations of airports, but those standards are set for different types of aircraft. If you have Boeing 747s, then you have to meet a much higher standard than if you have the mix of aircraft that we have. One of the issues that we've been trying to resolve and that needs to be resolved is which standard is the appropriate standard for Easthampton Airport. Is it the 20-to-1 or is it the 34-to-1, which would have required much more extensive clearing? I think we have now reached agreement that 20-to-1, which is the historical standard at Easthampton, is the appropriate standard, and we should not be looking to upgrade to a more demanding level. The second issue is whether you clear cut or cut selectively. And that really depends, again, on this issue of how many trees are we talking about that penetrate these approach surfaces. If you are, as you get further from the runway, the surface gets higher, and the percentage of trees that might be a problem gets much lower. We're trying to figure out the tree heights so that the decision can be made by the town where you're going to clear cut, because most of the trees penetrate, and where you're going to try to find the 1 or 2 that are a particular problem.
Okay. I think there's one other problem in this mix.
Only one?
At least one other problem in this mix, and that is on this map we show the airport property, but over here is not airport property, and here in the town of Southampton is not airport property. And we did a calculation because somebody said, let's just clear the trees that the FAA would like to have us clear on the airport to meet the 34-to-1 requirement. So that would be a nice gentle slope. And we would clear those trees on the airport. The only problem is when the airplane would get to the Southampton border, it would be about 25 to 30 feet off the ground. And how big did you say those trees were in the forest?
Well, we think they're mostly in the range of 50 feet.
Okay, so the airplane would come at a nice, gentle takeoff angle, being at 30 feet, and unfortunately the forest was at 50.
Yeah.
So we had a very practical problem because, as most of us recognize, the town of Easthampton residents are not thrilled about the airport, and they certainly wouldn't be thrilled if we came in and asked them to chop down all their trees. So we pretty much abandoned, as a practical matter, the 34-to-1 approach.
There were a lot of issues about the 34-to-1 approach, but I think the deciding factor ultimately was that we couldn't actually clear to that standard if we wanted to. So we would have had an improperly cleared 34-to-1 approach because of private property and property in the town of Southampton, as opposed to trying to have a properly cleared 20-to-1 approach at a lower standard. And I think ultimately it was recognized that we're better off trying to have a properly done 20-to-1 than an improperly done 34-to-1.
Okay, now, Gene, as a pilot, can you live with a properly done 30?
I can live with, you know, speaking for the Aviation Association, I can live with, and I think they can live with, what the FAA requires. If the FAA is requiring 34-to-1, which they are not, maybe you'd consider that. But during our discussions in the Airport Management Committee, we were thrown a curveball when Baker suddenly announced, well, they may require...
Tell who Baker is.
Baker's Engineering.
Baker Engineering. The FAA may require 50-to-1. Well, that turned out not to be true at all. So I think Baker was setting the criteria to something that really didn't meet the necessary requirements for Easthampton Airport. And 20-to-1, as David says, if we can clear to a proper 20-to-1 and satisfy the FAA's requirements and reinitiate the instrument approaches that have been lost because this has been dragging on for so long, I think the Aviation Association would support it as long as it's an FAA requirement.
Yeah.
We should clarify, there's really only one approach, one instrument approach of, I believe, 6 that's currently not available at night because of tree penetrations.
Right.
And the trees that are offending are actually in Southampton. So we're unlikely to be able to do anything about that one approach in any case.
Right.
So the instrument approach problem is largely solved. Now we have to figure out how to assure that the approaches are safe day and night.
Yeah, and I think for our viewers, we're now talking not about 200 acres of trees, we're talking about 5 or 6 acres of trees.
That's the hope.
That's the hope. And the plan now is to go to the FAA with our approach plan and our method of cutting trees selectively in parts and clear cutting where we have to, and see if they will go along with this before we start going down an expensive road of cutting trees that then the FAA says, go back and cut more, go back and do it a different way. So we're trying to, I don't want to use the word approach too many times, we're trying to come at this problem. We're trying to approach the approach problem in a reasonable way. I think it's fair to say everybody on the committee wants to clear the trees that penetrate the 20-to-1 lines, and now we just want to make sure we do it in a way that satisfies the FAA.
Well, we want to have a safe airport. We
have to have a safe airport. I think.
And cost is also an issue. Initially, we were told in one of the proposals by Baker Engineering that it was going to cost $400,000 or $500,000 to clear however many trees. Now we're talking about 5 acres worth of trees. I can't imagine it would cost anywhere near that. Yeah, because that's money that's sorely needed for other priorities.
Yeah. So I think that gives everybody an idea that this is an easy problem to describe in a sentence, and a very difficult problem to solve in a way that meets FAA standards, is cost effective, and also protects our forest area. I just, as a footnote here, just point out that the airport sits over a water recharge area for the sole source aquifer, so that the tree canopy is of great importance not only to people at the airport, but a very strong rallying point for people who want to protect the aquifer, protect all of our water resources.
I should add that the airport and the forested land on the airport is also contiguous to preserved lands, lands that have been set aside, and that gives the contiguous forest a special protected status that we need to be conscious of.
Okay. Again, easy problem to describe. We've been working pretty hard as a group to try to resolve it. The other problem that sounds easy to describe is the deer problem. Gene, as a pilot...
No one in Easthampton thinks that's easy.
That's true, that's true. Gene, could you describe what happens when you land at Easthampton Airport in the evening? On a bad day or a good day?
The deer seem to be most active, at dawn and dusk. And while we have a deer fence at the airport, and during most of the day you don't see anything, around late in the day as the sun's going down, they start wandering out, onto the
grazing area.
The grazing area around the runways and the taxiways, and there have been incidents where aircraft have hit them. They're also active at night, and of course, a plane coming in at night doesn't have a great deal of forward vision, and there have been some fairly expensive accidents of deer with aircraft.
I think it's important to note that this is not a theoretical problem. We've had happily, nobody's been injured yet.
Nobody's been hurt so far.
But we have had planes hit deer with their landing gear, which is certainly not the most productive. How do you get rid of the deer now, Gene?
Well, you pick the time. I pick the time that I fly. I try to fly when they're not around. And
how do you take care of them when they are around? Do you just come in and hope for the best, or?
Well, they will generally get out of the way at the last minute. What I fly, flies. I probably fly slower than most people drive, but the deer will generally, get out of the way. Sometimes, I've had to chase them off the runway, trying to come into land, and come around to land again, and they're back out on the runway again.
Yeah. By the way, just so that our audience doesn't think that nothing has been done, up until about a year and a half ago, the old deer fence had several holes that hadn't been repaired for a decade. Those holes have been repaired. However, as you see on this map, this is Daniels Hole Road, and there's a lot of deer fence along Industrial Road and so forth. But unfortunately, the deer fence on this side of the airport is over here, and I'm not sure why, but we hope the deer aren't smart enough to walk around the deer fence, cross the road, and just hop a 3 or 4 foot fence. Unfortunately, they're pretty smart, and they've been hopping for years. So now we're trying to figure out a way of building a fence line along Daniels Hole Road, but not build the fence so high as to keep out the deer at the cost of having pilots crash into the fence. So, again, these problems are not exactly the easiest to...
Well, what you didn't make clear, Arthur, is that the deer fence, which was built a couple of decades ago, has never completely enclosed the airfield.
Right.
There are huge areas where the smart deer and the not so smart deer can simply walk onto the airfield with no obstruction at all. Yeah. And what we're trying to do now is to finish the fence in a manner that completely encloses the airfield, which will, without question, reduce the number of deer.
Yeah. The other thing we should probably talk about a little bit today, in closing, is the fuel farm. We don't really grow fuel, but rather
we reap it.
We reap it. We reap it. We reap it. There are about 1 million gallons of gas a year, jet fuel and regular low lead, sold at the airport, and as a result, during the busy season, with our present operation, fuel is delivered sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. Would one of you want to describe what the conditions are of the present? David, why don't you take it?
Well,
What's the
one of the
present fuel
issues
farm?
is we don't actually know with certainty the present condition. We have buried fuel tanks, which was a common practice all over the country, both for gas stations and airfields at one time, and is now heavily disfavored. And the reason it's disfavored is that you can't tell whether there are leaks. So now the standards are much higher, as they should be, and the expectation is that fuel tanks will be above ground, that they'll be protected by concrete bunkers in one way or another, so that even if there is a leak, in fact, even if a fuel tank should fail completely, that the fuel will be contained. So it's past time, really, for the airport to upgrade its facility to ensure that there's not going to be any contamination of the aquifer that lies underneath, and that's an ongoing project. So we'll have a modern, up-to-date facility that will be much more secure than what we have now.
Yeah. Well, for our viewers, we have a sketch of the fuel farm, and the sketch shows the fuel farm that should be in operation by the fall, we hope. The idea is to build the new fuel farm while still having the other one, the existing fuel farm, operating. And you'll see here these gray sheds, really, and they're going to be over 3 large fuel tanks above ground, enclosed with a dike in case of, God forbid, a fuel spill happens, with some eye wash stations to protect people, and generally be a modern facility, much cheaper to operate and much more conducive to the kind of environment we have over there, which again is the sole source aquifer underneath this airport area. That little fuel farm, by the way, will cost about $1 million. So we're not talking about small expenditures here.
And we want somebody to explain why they're called farms.
Okay, well that's our next segment. In our next segment, we're going to be discussing litigation and problems with the fuel farm, with the airport noise restrictions. And I want to thank both of you again for being with us.
Thank you.
For 2 segments. I think you're wearing out.